Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Cedum, and in today's video, I'm going to be showing you my ultimate Halo Infinite settings guide to give you the best picture quality, the best FPS, or if you're like me and you want the best of both worlds, this video's got you covered too. Now, today's video is going to be a very in-depth guide on every setting in Halo and how it can affect your gameplay, visuals, and FPS. So if you'd like to skip to any different section, I've got chapters and timestamps below. Feel free to go right ahead. But if you want to get the most out of your system, whether you're playing on console or PC, let's go ahead and get started. All right, now a really key note to make here before we get started on the review is that everything that we're doing today is going to be based, of course, on my system and my specs, which I'll list over here for you so you can take a look and compare that to what you have at home. Now, having said that, the FPS that you're going to be seeing on my system doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get that same FPS or FPS gain or loss, but the percentage gain and loss should be about the same, which is what we're going for today. Guys, I got to start off by just saying too, how beautiful does this game look? I mean, what you're looking at here is one of the intro training ground cutscenes. And on the right-hand side is full ultra settings. So everything cranked up to the max on 1440p. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing 1440p, but with modified settings. And it looks freaking great. But look at the FPS difference. I'm getting almost 150 frames on the left and only about 70 to 80 on the right. I mean, it's double the FPS and the game still looks fantastic. So that's what you're in for in today's video.
It's not going to be easy, but I believe in you.
All right, so the first setting is the field of view. Now, this one's pretty self-explanatory. The lower the number, the more narrow your vision is, which makes objects appear closer and it makes them look a little bit larger on your screen. The larger the number, the more wide angle your field of view is, but you got to be careful because it can also kind of give you a fishbowl effect if you have it set too high. Now, during my comparison, the FOV only changed my FPS by about 1% at most, even from going down to the lowest at 65 up to the highest at 120. Now, we'll say from a competitive standpoint, having a higher FOV does have some competitive advantages by not having to pan left and right as frequently because you can see more on your screen at one time. But there is, more for your eyes to take in, more for your system to compute. So typically, a higher FOV will result in a slightly lower FPS. Now, for the rest of the test today, I'm going to be using a 93 FOV as our baseline to give us a nice even starting point. In addition, during the rest of the testing, we're only going to be changing one setting at a time. So when we go to the next setting, all other settings will be turned off or as absolutely low as they can go. All right, next up is Anti-Aliasing. Now, this is a feature that reduces the jagged edges or ruggedness of some of the images and helps smooth them out. But it can have the side effect of making your images look slightly blurry around the edges. Now, if this is something you don't like about anti-aliasing, you can have this turned on and counter some of the blurriness by using the Sharpening tool, which we'll get to later. Now, as you can see in the test, the anti-aliasing only affected my FPS by less than 1%. So it's very, very negligible, a very small hit, and in my opinion, looks way better with it turned on. All right, next up is texture filtering. Now, this is supposed to make your images look more detailed and rich, look less blocky, and dynamically change depending on how far away you are from items. But I'll be honest, I had a very hard time telling a difference with this thing going from low, even all the way up to ultra. Just take a look at the comparisons here. You can go back and forth, and there are only slight lines that you see that are improved, where some of the finishes look just a little bit better than the one previously. And I'll be honest, for such a small visual improvement, I saw the FPS hit anywhere from 0 to 4% by going from low to ultra with the texture filtering. So in my opinion, this is one of those features that, yeah, it might be nice to have, but I'm certainly not going to turn it on at the expense of my system's performance since it's only given me such a small visual gain. Okay, it's the same story with Ambient Occlusion too. This is supposed to dynamically adjust shading, rendering, and allows for more depth to be noticed. This is basically a software-based ray tracing, but again, in the comparison, I'm having a really tough time noticing any big improvement visually from having Ambient Occlusion go from low up to ultra. Now, to be fair, the FPS hit wasn't that bad. It was only about 1%, give or take. So this one is kind of one of those take it or leave it items, but I didn't see any visual reason why I would want to turn this on. All right, the next one up is texture quality. Now, this one is going to be very GPU based. Texture quality basically means higher resolution textures, so more detail in all the surfaces and images that you're looking at. Now, 343 has included a nice little slider bar for your VRAM usage. Your VRAM is determined based on what kind of GPU you have. So for my 2080 Ti, I have a maximum of about 11 gigabytes available. Ideally, it says that should be around 8.6, and currently with our baseline, I'm at 3.0. Now, when I crank up the textures to Ultra, I hit about 6.09 gigabytes of VRAM usage, which is still under the ideal amount, so I'm still okay, but the visual quality that I'm noticing isn't that much improved. And it's really weird to say. Usually when you go from low to high or ultra quality textures in almost any game, it's immediately noticeable. But Halo, I'm having a tough time really telling a big difference of going from low to medium and even all the way up to ultra. And when you start looking at the FPS hit that you'd get, that's actually pretty unfortunate because it's about an 8 to 9% drop in FPS from having your texture quality from low all the way up to ultra. And ironically enough, the geometry quality actually makes a pretty noticeable difference here. The geometry quality is going to affect a number of things, including view distance quality, reducing the in and out pop in, and the overall smoothness of different objects, shapes, and characters. Now, most notably during this test, you can look at the Grunt's outline of his body. On the low setting, it's very jagged, but on the ultra geometry setting, it's actually got a very smooth shaped body, which for me is really important because it kind of breaks the immersion if you end up looking at an enemy that looks like he's playing out of Minecraft. So for me, I'm a big fan of geometry quality being as high as you can go, and it did give me about a 2% hit on my overall FPS, and it used almost 1 full gigabyte of VRAM, so that's something to keep in mind while you're making your adjustments. All right, now next up is reflections, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's dynamic reflections based on different surfaces like floors, walls, ceilings, but not so much things that you'd think of like mirrors and glass. Now, during the reflections test, this is one of the easiest ones to really notice a difference, especially indoor hallways. When you have lights and different objects reflecting off the walls and ground, it's very noticeable, but unfortunately, it also takes a huge hit on performance. On average, I saw a 12% FPS drop when going from off to ultra on reflections. Although it is important to note that if you do love having the reflections, but you don't want to take as big of a hit as possible, I'd recommend going to the medium setting because it still gives you almost the same amount and type of reflections as ultra, but you do save some FPS there. All right, next up is the shadow quality. Now, unlike other games, this doesn't necessarily help you see better in the darker areas, but it does bring out the visual depth in shadows and adds real directional shadows based upon what light source is casting on them. Now, unfortunately, even though this setting does look good having it turned all the way up, it did take a pretty big hit on our performance. I saw an 11% drop in FPS when going from the lowest setting to the highest available setting for shadows. Now, it is worth noting here as well that you can go to the medium setting, which is where the shadows really start to bring out some of the depth without getting such a big FPS hit as going to ultra. All right, next up is lighting quality. Now, this is the distance at which the lights are rendered and the shadows that they create, along with the quality and number of those shadows. So the higher the setting is, the more interior lights you'll actually see turned on. You'll see more bright light bulbs as opposed to just a fixture, and the more shadows that you'll see that are casted based on those light sources. Okay, now this is a good pause point here for us. So these next few settings, the fog, the clouds, and the wind, these are really all campaign geared settings. And since at the time of this recording, the campaign is not out, I can't give you a proper representation of how these settings will look in game. What I can do is tell you that if you're playing multiplayer, turn these settings low or off because you will not see a visual difference in your game, but you will get about a 1% FPS drop for each setting that you have turned on. So again, if you're going to be doing campaign, then maybe you want to have these turned on for the full effect. I can't show you how much of a difference it's going to be, unfortunately, until the campaign comes out. But for multiplayer, for sure, keep them turned off. And following suit here, the ground cover quality is again one of those campaign settings, but there is a noticeable difference that I can show you here. And you'll see that the ground just has a bit more detail and foliage and small rocks and pebbles that are added to it, just to give you a little bit more immersion. And the FPS hit honestly wasn't that bad. In some cases, it was about the same. In other cases, it was less than 1%. So personal preference here if you want to turn this one on, but again, for multiplayer, for sure, leave it off. All right, now on to a big one. The effects quality will have a huge impact on your performance and a pretty big change in the visual difference of your game as well. And in this first comparison, you can see that the character has an overshield turned on, and on the low effects quality, there is no dynamic light being reflected from the overshield onto the gun or the wall. But on the effects ultra quality, you can see there's a huge bright white light being reflected from just the overshield that the character's wearing, that then bleeds off onto the wall around it and bleeds back onto the assault rifle, casting more shadows. And you can even see there's some particle effects from the plasma and gunshot burst down below. The second example is pretty similar, where the character's shield is about to overheat and burst, and so he's glowing blue. But on the low quality, all that you can see is the shield glowing blue. But on the ultra quality, the shield is glowing so bright that it's reflecting the blue burst from his own shield onto the surrounding ammunition falling out of the gun and the gun itself. So this one's very, very noticeable, but in my opinion, it actually could be a bit overwhelming at times too, because there is such a thing as too many VFX, visual effects. And in the middle of an intense gunfight, you got a bunch of explosions and colors and bright lights shining in your face. It could potentially throw you off of your shot too. And the last test is going to be the grenade demonstration, where the frag grenade on low quality just has a pretty flat looking explosion. There's no real depth to the smoke or the fire. And then on ultra quality, you can see that there's a bit more depth and three-dimensional effect to the smoke, to the burst, and there's particles that actually explode from the grenade. Those particles that then bounce off of the surrounding walls and objects to give a more animated effect. Now, having said all that, the FPS hit that we get from the effects quality is very significant. In my opinion, it's the worst culprit that I've ever seen. It's a 20 to 30% hit in the FPS, depending on what's actually happening in the game. And even when there aren't crazy effects going on in the game, simply by having this option turned on, you're always going to be taking a really big hit in performance. So the effects is one of those things where I could see you wanting to crank it up for a campaign for just the best immersive experience. But for multiplayer purposes, I would really suggest turning this off for the FPS gain that you're going to get, but also for the lack of VFX in your face. It might make it actually a little bit easier to play competitively. All right, next up is the animation quality. Now, this again is another one of those campaign settings. It doesn't actually affect or change the animations in multiplayer. And even in the training mode, when I was walking around just watching AI do different tasks and doing different animations, it doesn't affect that. So unfortunately, I can't show you a big difference here, but from the testing that I was able to complete, it was a 0 to 1% hit in your FPS. So I wouldn't be too concerned with leaving this on auto. Of course, if you have a really good CPU, since this is CPU driven, you could put it on max for the best effect. All right, now next up is the terrain quality. I'm happy to report this is only about a 1% FPS hit, and it is very noticeable for close range terrain, but it even helps reduce pop-in for long distance terrain. Again, that's going to be more of a campaign thing than multiplayer, but this was a good change with very minimal impact on your performance. All right, we're in the final stretch, guys. So the last couple settings here, we got simulation quality. This is going to be CPU driven and again, more of a campaign thing. It's going to help with like vehicle suspension physics and vehicle audio, but I really couldn't tell the difference during any of my testing. So again, campaign, turn this on, multiplayer, leave it off. Flocking quality, obviously this is referring to wildlife. During the testing that I did, I could not see any difference in the wildlife or the Pelican dropships that drove around in the background. I think that's just because they're pre-programmed and not exactly a natural, wildlife that's can randomly pop in and out like the campaign. So unfortunately, I can't show you any more detail on those two. Then the last one before the sensory items, the Async. Now the Async compute is for higher GPU cards that have it. It allows your GPU to do multiple works in parallel, and it should bump your performance, but at the cost of stability. On a couple of the tests that I did, at one point, it literally dropped my FPS in half. But in another test that I did, it decreased my FPS by 1, and I didn't really notice any performance improvement. So this, I would just say, test at your own risk. Worst case scenario, you can just unclick it to turn it off, but it won't hurt anything to click it on and see if your FPS improves or not. Then lastly, on to sensory items. Now, a lot of this is going to be personal preference. For me, I always turn off blur, screen shake, exposure. Full screen effects is just how transparent you want the items to be on your HUD, and the speed lines if you want those little wind wavy lines to be on your screen while you're sprinting. Again, those are all personal preference items. The sharpening tool, however, at the bottom can change your FPS by literally 1 or 2 FPS, but this is the tool I was mentioning in the beginning of the video to help combat the anti-aliasing. So if you turn on anti-aliasing and it looks to be a little bit too blurry for your likings, then just crank up the sharpness until you have it somewhere where you like it. Whew. All right, guys, I wasn't kidding when I said this is going to be a very in-depth video of all the settings you can fine-tune for Halo Infinite to give you the best picture quality and the best FPS. I appreciate you if you stuck around this long. I know that means you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with a buddy, and get subscribed if you're new to the channel. We've got a ton more of Halo content coming your way, guides, tips and tricks, and how-to videos. Now, let's do a quick recap for those slackers who skipped towards the end. Don't worry, we love y'all too. All right, so looking at all the settings, the top culprits that can damage or improve your FPS, depending on how you adjust them, are the effects quality, lighting, shadows, reflections, texture quality, and texture filters. Those would be the ones that I would go and tackle if you're looking to dial in your FPS, but still keeping a good picture quality to compromise with it. Now, of course, if you are a competitive player or you're trying to just get the absolute best FPS, where you're going to be playing on 1080p, the lowest resolution, and turning all your settings on to low, that's totally fine. But if you're more of a casual gamer or you're really just trying to enjoy the campaign in all of its glory, I hope this video helps you fine-tune and dial in your settings. By the time you guys are watching this video, the campaign will be out, so I hope you're enjoying exploring Zeta Halo as much as I am. I'll be live streaming again on twitch.tv/C_dome. Come stop by, let me know what you thought about the video, and tell me how you've been enjoying the campaign. And we're going to be doing a legendary run-through and try to get to that legendary ending as soon as possible. So thank you guys very much for watching. I really do appreciate your support. I will see y'all in the next video. Take care. Peace.